Hello, everyone, and welcome to What Magic Can Teach Us About Misinformation here on Friday the 13th. My name is Carmel Shachar, and I am the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School's Executive Director. I think that there's no better topic to tackle on Friday the 13th than what magic can teach us about one of the scariest things of all, which is misinformation and disinformation about health. Misinformation and disinformation about health is causing a lot of conflict, a lot of problematic health outcomes, and a lot of suffering. And I think understanding how our brains process and react to it, and the insight of how magic can understand a little bit more, help us understand a little bit more about our brains is going to be a really fruitful, wonderful topic. Before I introduce our moderator for this session, there is going to be an opportunity for Q&A, and we're really looking forward to your questions. Please submit questions at any time using the Zoom Q&A feature found in the meeting controls at the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring and pulling questions to ask our panelists. You're, of course, welcome to join the conversation or even submit questions on Twitter. We're at Petrie-Flom. We will share the fully captioned event video with all registrants, meaning you, but also other people who registered for the event within 1 to 2 weeks. Please feel free to share that link with friends, colleagues who you think might find this event interesting. If you have any technical issues, and we very much hope that you don't, please email us at petrie-flom@law.harvard.edu. That's going to be the best way to get a hold of us. If you like this event and are interested in seeing more from us, please check out some of our other events. The best way to find out about those is to sign up for our newsletter. It comes out only twice a month, so we are not going to spam your inbox, we promise. Some upcoming events we have, I'm particularly excited about our February 10th event on climate change and health, understanding the roles and responsibilities of the healthcare sector when it comes to combating climate change. If you are still hungry for some really interesting discussions on health policy, bioethics, biotechnology, please check out our blog, Bill of Health, where we have a space for thought leaders, for scholars to really put forward some cutting-edge scholarship in a way that is very accessible. With those plugs completed, I would like to hand this event over to Stephen Wood, who is our visiting fellow, as well as a nurse with extensive background in emergency medicine and ICU care. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Hello and welcome, everybody. As Carmel mentioned, my name is Stephen Wood. I'm a critical care nurse practitioner, practicing both in emergency medicine and in the ICU. I have a special interest in ethics, and I was a bioethics fellow both at the Harvard Medical School, and I'm now a visiting fellow here at the Petrie-Flom Center at Harvard Law School. And I'm also an amateur magician. So this is bringing a lot of my interests together into a dream come true. So I'm really excited that we could do this event today, particularly on Friday the 13th, which has some special meaning. We just had a full moon. It would have been nice to have all that aligned, but you know, this is still going to be a wonderful event. And I'm joined today by 3 fantastic panelists. I'm joined by Jeanette Andrews, who is a magician, artist, and speaker. She's an affiliate alumni of the Meta Lab at Harvard, as well as Dr. Ross McKinney, who's the Chief Scientific Officer and Senior Medical Scientist for the Association of American Medical Colleges, as well as Dr. Jay Olson, who is a Behavioral Science Fellow for the Government of Canada. So 3 really wonderful presenters from unique backgrounds. And the format today, we're going to start out, of course, with some magic performance led by Jeanette, and then we'll have each speaker have some time to provide their insight, We'll follow that up with a Q&A. So I'll be monitoring the Q&A session. So please, if you have questions, comments, please put them in the QA, and we'll be sure to try to get to those at the end of the event. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce my colleague, Jeanette Andrews.
Hi. Well, hello, everyone. I could not be more delighted to be here with you. Again, my name is Jeanette Andrews, and I'm a magician and artist based in New York City. And my work and research deals a lot with how we perceive and construct the experiences around us. And that sort of takes the form of performances, talks, installations, sculpture, and audio. So we'll kick things off today with a quick piece of magic to sort of frame our conversation. This is one of my favorites to share with people, as this is actually one of the first pieces of magic in written human history and can be traced back to the first book published on magic and magic secrets in the Western world. So we know this dates back to at least 1584 and uses just two items: a spool of thread and some scissors. And Stephen, I'm going to have you be in charge of the scissors for us. Cut it for us. This image represents what is certain, and it is the picture I hope to leave you with in the end. Stephen, I'll have you cut it again for us. So I thank you so much, Dr. McKinney. I love your expression. And again, so I feel so fortunate to come from such a long tradition of people who've been deeply invested in how we see and perceive the world around us, and that a lot of times there are different vantage points that are coming together to create those experiences in what may be intentional and not intentional. So I will go ahead and actually quickly share a couple of thoughts with you on this as we begin today. So just so we can get to some basic definitional things out of the way first, the APA, the American Psychological Association, states that misinformation is false or inaccurate information. So just kind of getting the facts wrong. The intent behind that is typically not considered malicious or intentional, as opposed to disinformation, which is false information, which is deliberately created or spread to mislead or by intentionally misstating facts or posing things as factual that are not. Right now we'll actually try an experiment together. If you would direct your attention to me up in the upper right hand corner, in a moment, I'm going to ask everybody to lean straight in towards your screen. If you're in a wheelchair like I am, that means basically just roll straight forward towards your computer. If you're watching on a tablet or mobile device, just bring it straight towards your body. Okay. I also kindly request that everybody make the screen full screen now. That will be important. You'll see why later on, but please go ahead, do make sure that my slide deck is on full screen for you now. Okay, so currently on your screen, you should see an image of a plus sign and a circle. Together, we'll all make the image of the circle vanish. Here's how. Please go ahead and close your right eye. So right eye closed. And now please cross the gaze of your left eye. So your left eye is focusing on the plus sign and only the plus sign. Right eye closed, left eye staring at the plus sign and nothing else. And now, as you continue to keep your right eye closed, left eye staring at that plus sign, lean straight in towards your screen. And at a certain point, you should see the circle disappear. When it does, you can stop and then move either further or closer to your screen. I'll leave this image up for a little bit as I give a brief description of what is happening here. I'll also talk through it for 2 seconds one more time. Right eye closed, left eye staring at the plus sign and only the plus sign, and then move further or closer to your screen. So if you got the circle to vanish for you, what you've just done is find what's kind of lovingly, colloquially known as your blind spot. This is actually where your optic nerve is situated in your eye. It's a very tiny portion in the back of your eye that is not sensitive to light in the way that the rest of your eye is. So you're not really seeing anything, as we often sort of think of that word, but your brain is filling in the missing part of the image with what it thinks should be there. So in this case, it's the blank white space. If you're interested in learning more about optic nerve blind spots, quick Google will turn up some other images on this. I also will be sharing this slide deck with you so you can play with this on your own. Again, I think this does show how both your biology and your psyche are working together to sort of fill in with what it thinks should be there. In this case, again, is the blank white space. This can also be done with things like complex visual patterns. Your brain will actually fill in place of where that circle or that point is, will fill in the missing part of an image based on the information, both temporally and spatially, that is surrounding it. So I think, again, this is a great way to think about how maybe we fill in those mental gaps. So that brings me to really talk about how we are thinking about, or certainly how I think about, the correlation between magic and medical misinformation and disinformation. So as we just had this example of sort of the physical filling in of gaps in presented information, this happens psychologically as well when we're presented either with too much or too little information. We've seen this quite often throughout, especially the course of the pandemic, of sort of information overwhelm and the idea of things being overloaded, despite, this is sort of continues to ramp up, both in terms of the speed in which we're presented with information and just overall quantity. So when you're presented with so much information, obviously your brain does have to make a lot of shortcuts to be able to understand what to take in or not. And likewise with missing information. We'll get into talking about cognitive bias here in a moment, but this is very much what happens with magic. Magic performances are very carefully constructed to then either overwhelm a viewer with too much information, so you're having to pick out what seems like only the most important pieces of information, or maybe not quite enough information. And so then there you are making those mental leaps based on the perceptual information that you have to create a complete experience. So this is now we're advancing in the doc. Seems like this is basically what I was talking about before, where you're a lot of times either skimming information and trying to fill in those mental gaps, whether consciously or unconsciously. We as a species are always craving certainty, so we're always kind of on that hunt to be able to complete a picture, complete information. There's a great article that was put together by Filippo Mencasa, apologies if you happen to be watching, and Thomas Hills for Scientific American, in which they talk about how this process of information overwhelm creates into filling in the mental gap. They wrote this recently for Scientific American, talking about how we're unable to publish all of this material, and then that's where a lot of times our cognitive biases jump in to then start to fill in those gaps. So if you do see something or even part of something that is presented to you to be true, then you're more likely to continue on in that frame of belief. So we see this all the time in the construction of magic performances, when you're presented with pieces of an experience or information that, while not fully accurate, present you with enough of a structure, and you sort of feel like you have enough of an overarching idea of what you're seeing and what you're believing to create what feels like a robust and salient experience. For example, we were just speaking moments earlier about the idea that if one is, say, for example, watching a card trick and you're seeing all of the cards facing one direction, you inherently believe that all the cards are facing a certain direction. That's the sort of thing where your mental processes are kicking in to just create experiences for you that may or may not be what is actually physically, tactilely presented before you. And then as magicians, we oftentimes really try to have a deep understanding and awareness of what those things are and then how they can be transformed. In fact, it was a fellow artist of mine who also is an alumni affiliate of MetaLab, Halsey Bergend, who talked about magicians being ethical disinformation designers, which is a phrase I found really charming. So then kind of my last point on some of this is the idea that a lot of times we think of magic as being based on surprise, and surprise and expectation violation often help in both the creation and perpetuation of false memories or sharing of false information. So of course, anything that we see that are sort of more dramatic or emotional events, we are more likely to remember them. As magicians, we construct experiences that have things that are moments that are built in along the way, sort of create almost mental handhold, mental thresholds that then you can easily glom onto and remember certain points in a structure, certain points throughout time, objects, words, experiences that when you reflect back on them, or even in real time, they may or may not be the case. Sometimes things that are a little ambiguous sometimes based on what you're hearing and what you're seeing can be conjoined to create something that maybe is a little different. So a lot of times, certainly when we think about people sharing false information, if they're creating that information, a lot of times with the filling in of those mental gaps, they're taking in some piece of information. And then if you even have a slight cognitive bias towards that piece of information, you're more likely to have that sort of mental linchpin and then further that down the role. So then again, this was a study that was done in 2016 that then actually it was an essay that was in Current Biology that was talking about magic and cognitive neuroscience, where they talked about how even an ambiguous statement with a subtle insinuation can reinforce a false memory. So for example, it is impossible for a magician to find a card shuffled in a deck by a spectator for that to just randomly occur. However, we also know that there's methodology built in that has created that so that you have the sort of false memory that's happening that took a card, shuffled it back into the deck, and then the magician found your card. When in reality, that's really not what actually happened. There were a lot of steps along the way that you just didn't happen to perceive. So what are sort of our takeaways from the correlation between these two things? And how, kind of what can we learn from these processes on magic? I think magic very explicitly shows us our ability to see and take away information that might be different from reality into both how the information is designed and presented to us, and then also how we are perceiving that information. So it's a very clear two-way street, a very kind of did the tree fall in the forest if no one's there to perceive it sort of thing. There is a very dynamic perceptual relationship that happens in sort of the creation of illusion. I think the difference is magic is often thought of as fun and delightful and surprising in a good way. And I think is a really hopefully a fun way to talk about how we are able as humans, all of us, no matter how smart, how educated, we all fall prey to our own biases, our own thoughts, our own suggestions, information overwhelm, all of these things that then come in to sort of, I think, deceive us knowingly or unknowingly. And I'll wrap up with this basically on sort of ideas on maybe how the relationship with magic can help, is that people are often looking for more emotional and responses, things that may seem more important or less important, more prioritizing those things. Deb Lavoie did a 2021 TED Talk in which she titled How to Recognize Disinformation and How to Stop It. And her talk was not about magic at all, but interestingly, it used some of this language, which was to kind of always be looking for the trick, kind of this adoption of a skeptical attitude, to pause and then take a sec to check. So you were really thinking about, okay, if we were reflecting on a piece of magic, perhaps, magic has this structure built into it, and can be, I think, hopefully a helpful way to think about how we think about misinformation and disinformation. If we think about, we're aware that there's a trick happening, we're looking for the trick, we're pausing, and then we're reflecting upon how things may have unfolded. I will drop this link in the chat later on. These slides, especially if you want to play with that optic nerve blind spot, will be available to you. geneticinterest.com, PF for Petrie-Flom. This is case sensitive. And so with that, I'll drop that link to you later, but I'm going to turn it back over to Stephen. And stop my share.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. That was very, very insightful. And thank you very much. And she'll drop that link in there for you as well. Dr. McKinney, I don't know if you prepared a performance piece for us as well, but I'd like to, again, bring up Dr. Ross McKinney from the Association of American Medical Colleges. Thank you, Dr. McKinney, for your insight.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. That was wonderful. Thank you, Jeanette. It was, I particularly like the trick. That was really cool. And the blind spot, yeah, it's cool. So I'm going to be talking about this from a medical point of view, trust and knowledge. What we want to maintain is trust, and we'd like to increase the amount of knowledge. And the trouble is that we are dealing with a lot of mis and disinformation. So here is an example. So here is Tucker Carlson on October 18th this year, last year. The CDC could make COVID vaccines mandatory for kids. That was the theme. Obviously, this vaccination is a great crime against people. Protecting people is, a bad thing, apparently. But in fact, the CDC wasn't talking about making COVID vaccine mandatory for kids at all. That wasn't even part of the discussion. Tucker Carlson was lying. For the record, this was a complete fabrication. The CDC was considering whether to add COVID vaccines to the Vaccines for Children's list that pays for vaccines for low-income children. So basically, Tucker Carlson lied to increase his audience and because he was trying to score points. That's disinformation. So misinformation is information, as we heard from Jeanette, that is factually incorrect. It may, in fact, reflect a lack of knowledge, or it may be by intent, but at the very least, it's information that is factually incorrect. The more narrow, disinformation is information that is misused to sway opinions. So the information may be completely false, it may be partially true, or it may be correct and used out of context. And the real issue for the listener, for both of these, the question is personal verification. Can I figure out what is real and accurate in this information I've been given? So here's another example. On September 3rd, the Associated Press noted two recent tweets. Yesterday, the National Institute of Health added ivermectin to the COVID treatments. Looks like the conspiracy theorists were right after all, and the experts were wrong once again. There were 44,000 likes. Suddenly, ivermectin shows up on the NIH website for treating COVID after years of denial, blocking, interference, vilification, ruining social media accounts, killing people, etc. They silently add it to their anti-COVID protocol. 39,000 likes. Well, again, this is disinformation. Both of those are complete lies. In fact, what the NIH website did was to state the panel recommends against the use of ivermectin for the treatment of COVID-19, except in clinical trials. So there was nothing of the sort of adding it to the treatment regimens. And nobody has ever found anything valuable about using ivermectin in COVID-19. All those clinical trials found that it was worthless. So you have disinformation believed by many in order to obtain an end. And what were they trying to achieve? They were trying to make the NIH look like a bumbling conspirator that is in it for themselves in some way and against public health, which was completely bogus. So disinformation, misuse of information in order to sway opinion and with no need to adhere to facts or reality. So how does disinformation work? There was a 2021 study, 1921, been a long time ago, 2021 study that found that 12 social media accounts, which were consistent of 11 individuals and one couple, who were responsible for 65% of all the anti-vaccine postings on Facebook and Twitter. So there are a few people making massive efforts to create and use disinformation, to lie away freely on Twitter and Facebook in order to try and sway opinions. Broadcast news entities have an increasingly tenuous adherence to verification protocols, as we heard from the Tucker Carlson episode earlier, and confirmation bias, as Jeanette talked about. When people want to believe something, they do less internal fact checking. When something complies with their expectations, they're more likely to just believe it. So this is a perpetual problem, and it's a really complicated problem in science. So how do I know that something I am told is true? And one of the problems in this is that there's a fundamental paradox that is part of the root of science. So truth should be based on facts, and I put truth in parentheses. And science, these facts come from observations, experiments, and interpretations. And a critical role of science is to constantly explore, to challenge existing hypotheses, to synthesize and create new facts. So what we knew in the past is not necessarily what we understand the truth to be now. And that is a normal part of science. It is constantly evolving. And while it is said to be self-correcting, there's a state where anything is potentially not certain. Now, there's some things that are certain to be, that are going to be real, but there are other things that, we just cannot be certain. And in fact, new observations may change our perceptions. The science of trying to understand, or the art of trying to understand it, is epistemology. So epistemology is the philosophical study of the nature and grounds of knowledge, especially its limits and validity. And epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from opinion. And it's we should be studying and considered how we are able to sort out what is a justified belief. So when science is in the public eye, scientists are in a position to read and interpret science for themselves. Most scientists do that. They read an article, they make their own opinion. In contrast, most people learning about science depend on interpreters. And those interpreters are friends, the press, politicians, and scientists. And all of those provide insights and input, explaining bits and pieces of the science that's out there, and how to sort out what is fact from opinion. They use those interpreters in order to try and understand. Are those interpreters going to be adequate? So in popular epistemology, the first question somebody should ask is, does the story make sense? Most people are aware the press likes stories that are unexpected. In fact, so does the scientific press. So in fact, the frequency of unexpected findings being recanted is higher than those that are just evolutionary findings on previous research. How solid is the evidence that is presented? And is it just hearsay? Is it something somebody said, or is it something that you are reading the actual facts upon which the conclusion, the piece of truth is based? Does the source have obvious conflicts of interest? Does the person giving you the interpretation have a conflict of interest? Are they a known anti-vaxxer, for example? So they're going to try and frame everything in the light of anti-vax. How well does it say, how well does the source, what they say, stand up over time? That's actually a good way to check the validity of where you're getting the information. When you've gotten information from that source in the past, did it hold up? Was it accurate? Did it stay consistent? If there was a change, did they offer an explanation as to why there was a change in their position? And is the source offering facts or an interpretation? So how do we cope with false messaging? If we're trying to convince somebody who is holding invalid positions, how do we try and talk with them? And one-on-one, you generally should try and figure out what is the basis for the person's understanding. What are the facts that they're drawing from to reach the conclusions that they've reached? Often, there's an underlying fear that has led to rationalizations that may not require a firm scientific underpinning. A person who is anti-vax does not actually have facts behind their position, but they are rationalizing because there is some fear or concern that vaccines or that people are out to get them in some way, and they are concerned, so they frame the information that they are hearing in such a way that they can rationalize a position which they wanted to believe. So for example, the person wants to believe vaccines are harmful because it's a personal construct or a narrative. It will be really difficult to use a reasoned approach to get past that, because the rationalization that they have will have encompassed many of those facts. And you can try, but it's impressive how infrequently that attempt will be successful. Repetition and independent verification can be useful if the person hears it from other people and then they hear it from somebody they trust. That may actually do what they need. One last slide. Societally, we need credible, reliable sources. We need people like the NIH to be believed. We need them to be reliable. They should give the basis of the information as well as the interpretation. Whoever is providing the information should be consistent. And if there's an inconsistency, explain why. And don't let the press stop at the answer was inconsistent when the reality was that the underlying facts changed. A new variant, for example, changed many of our expectations about which vaccines would work and how many doses. The answer that was the answer 6 months ago may be different now because it's a different variant. The press shouldn't stop at the answer was inconsistent. The press should respond to the fact that the variant came and so the facts changed. And it's always important to address myths directly. And those are my comments. So I'll hand it on to Jay, I believe.
Thank you very much, Dr. McKinney. That's some great insight, and I got some great questions that are popping up in the Q&A for you on some of those topics as well. But with no further ado, and to save time for those questions, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jay Olson, who is a behavioral science fellow for the Government of Canada. Take it away, Jay.
Thank you. So back when I was 5 years old, I was down at the furniture store with my parents. They were trying to find a sofa or something like this. And at the time I felt pretty bored, and one of the furniture store workers noticed that. And so he came over to me, he reached behind my ear and pulled out a coin. And then he took that coin, he made it vanish, and then he pulled that coin from his mouth. And so that was my first encounter with magic. And I was pretty fascinated by this. And this led me down this kind of long and windy path where I started off as a magician. And then I started researching kind of the psychology behind magic. And in particular, how magicians are able to influence audiences without them knowing. And then during my graduate and postdoctoral studies at McGill and Harvard, I studied how to apply the kind of tricks that magicians know in order to study the placebo effect. And so placebo effects are a topic that have lots of lots of misinformation around them. And there's a lot that we can learn about kind of the intersection of magic, placebos, and misinformation as well. So in terms of the placebo effect, usually when we think of a placebo, we think of a pill that you take that has nothing inside, but can still have some kind of positive effect. Though in placebo science, we think of placebos and placebo effects much more broadly. So placebos can be any kind of inactive treatment. So it can be a pill with no active chemical inside. They can be something like a surgery, like a sham surgery. So you believe that a surgery is happening, but it's actually just a sham one. They poke around, they don't actually do something. Or for example, this could be a placebo machine. So this could be a machine that you think is active and going to help you when really it's just a sham machine. And so the kinds of positive effects that you can get from some kind of drug or treatment, we can generally classify them into these two categories. So on one side, we can think of them as the specific effects. And so these would be the kind of positive effects that you would get from the chemical in the drug, for example, or from the physical procedure of the surgery, or from the machine. And these kind of specific effects, this is what we as a society know about, and we spend billions of dollars trying to enhance these and having these more effective drugs. And there's also the non-specific effects. So we can call these the contextual effects or the placebo effects. And these kind of effects, these have more to do with things like the context or the expectations that people have about the drug. So, for example, if they've seen this drug discussed in the news, or if they've seen other patients in the waiting room who have just had this drug and seeing those kinds of effects, or if they see some misinformation about this drug, these different information sources can all influence the strength of these kind of placebo effects. And then the overall effect, the overall positive effect that you would get from a drug would be the specific effect combined with these kind of non-specific or placebo effects. So from this conceptualization, basically any drug that you take or any treatment may have specific effects and then also non-specific ones. And depending on the kind of drug that you take, sometimes these placebo or non-specific effects are actually larger. And so this varies quite a bit based on the treatment, but there are some surgeries that seem to be effective primarily because of these different contextual factors and not about the kind of specific procedure that people will be doing. And sometimes people think that placebo effects are just effects that you kind of think that you have, or that they're quite weak, but in some cases they can be very strong. And so we tested this in a study that we did at McGill on placebo psychedelics. And so what we did is we brought in a bunch of participants into a room that was kind of set up like a psychedelic party. So we had psychedelic paintings on the walls, we had some trippy movies playing, we had this DJ there that was playing music, and we kind of set it up as this relaxed party-like vibe. And then we handed out these placebos. These were pink pills that we gave to the participants, and we told them that these contained a chemical similar to the active ingredient of magic mushrooms, and that they would have this 2 to 4 hour psychedelic experience after they consumed it. So we gave out these pills to the participants, and these were actually placebos that we gave them. And then the participants consumed them, and then we measured a bunch of different measures throughout, things like changes in their consciousness and changes in mood, changes in blood pressure, and that kind of thing. And 1/3 of the people in the room actually were Confederates. So they were kind of fake participants. And these fake participants, they had the role of playing out the effects of these drugs. So we told them to take the drug, then wait about 15 minutes, and then start acting as if they had taken a psychedelic drug, and acting out these different kinds of effects. So they would ask people if their palms were sweaty, they would be laughing more, kind of dancing to the music more. We were trying to set up the context in this way where people would be kind of effectively deceived from the environment and from these other confederates who were acting out these effects of the drug. And then what we did, 2 hours in, we gave them this assessment of the different kinds of experiences that they had throughout this trip. And what we found is about 2/3 the participants reported some kind of change in consciousness. So some participants said that they were staring at some of the paintings on the wall, and the paintings were like moving and reshaping themselves. Some people said that they felt this force pulling the back of their head, like gravity was stronger. Some people felt like they couldn't speak for some amount of time. They just wanted to be left alone, and then they would feel more social after that. And some people who had tried psychedelic drugs previously said that their experience was just like the same as when they've taken these drugs in the past. And so people had a range of experiences, some people experiencing nothing at all and were coming up to me as the experimenter and saying, is this a placebo that I took? And then some people feeling like they were having these effects that when we measured the change of consciousness, it was similar to the effect that you could expect from like a medium or high dose of this drug. So we see this huge kind of variability there. And then there was one participant that when she was leaving, after she had all these effects, she said, can I have the rest of the placebos? We still had about half a bottle left. And she said, because that was a very fun experience, and I'd like to have a placebo psychedelic party at my place next week as well, and kind of share this with my friends. And so some people had these kind of nice psychedelic-like experience just from taking a placebo. And so there's 3 things that we can take from this. First of all, the context really matters in the placebo effects. So the expectations that people have, and the stronger in general we can make the expectation that they've taken a drug or that they're going to have these specific effects, the more likely this is that they'll have these effects. The second take home is that placebo effects aren't just these kinds of changes that people think they have. So it's not just they take a pill and they feel like they're getting better, but they're not actually getting better. As far as we could tell, these people were actually experiencing these changes in their consciousness rather than just thinking that they were experiencing this. And then the third question that kind of pops up is whether that amount of deception is needed. And so there's this growing field of psychedelic science where they call I've been studying open label placebos. So open label would be a non-deceptive placebo. So you would give somebody a placebo, tell them that it's a placebo, and sometimes they still get the same effect. And so there's been some studies showing that if somebody has migraines, for example, taking a pill that they believe is a placebo can still help reduce their migraines. And there was one kind of case we had at our lab at McGill. There was this one research assistant who had to run a participant in 5 minutes, but she had this throbbing migraine. And so I brought out these placebo pills that we had used in the study, and then I said, these are extra strength placebos. And I told her a bit about the open label placebos and how they work with migraines. And so I gave her one of these pills. She took it, and then she felt like her migraine had vanished, and she could run this participant well. So this is kind of the positive side of placebo effects. We can leverage expectation, whether it's from the context or from, say, misinformation that we'll talk about soon. We can kind of leverage these contexts and these expectations to have positive effects. Then there's also the converse of this. So this is nocebo effects. So nocebo effects are negative effects that people have after they take a non-active treatment, something like a placebo pill. And so this could be like kind of a side effect. You can think of it like the placebo side effect that people can have, or sometimes this is like a slow down healing. And so we tested this in one study where we took participants at McGill and we put them into this brain scanner that we told them was a new kind of brain scanner that could both read and influence their thoughts. And then applying some of the kind of performative parts of magic, we really convinced them that this machine could do this using magic tricks kind of dressed up as neuroscience. And basically what we found was that the majority of the participants they would feel these kind of nocebo effects or these negative placebo effects, where they would feel like they were losing control over their thoughts as the machine was apparently controlling their thoughts. And so there was one participant who said things like, he was trying to think one thing, but then some kind of voice or force from the machine would drag him to think of something else. And he felt like he was kind of losing control over his mind in that kind of short period there. And kind of in the same way, these negative effects, they can be either like true side effects, say from an actual drug that you take, where the chemical happens to have side effects, or they can be kind of these contextual or these more nocebo effects, often caused by negative expectations, for example. And so if I give you an empty pill and I say this will reduce your headache, but a side effect is that it may make you more anxious, you can have the placebo effects from the headache improving, but then the nocebo effect from feeling more anxious from that. So placebos have both this positive and negative aspect. Now, kind of at the core of both of these is the expectations that people have, and the expectations about various different drugs or placebo-like treatments. So say if there's some kind of oil that people think that they can reduce their anxiety with by consuming, they get this information from a bunch of different sources, sometimes from the news, sometimes from friends and that kind of thing, and sometimes also from misinformation, for example. So from reading these kind of social media posts and seeing, for example, that this particular oil reduces anxiety, so then they take it thinking that that will work. Now, the oil itself may not have any effect on anxiety, but the kind of interesting interaction that you get here is that if they believe that this can reduce their anxiety, then sometimes the oil, through these kind of non-specific effects or through these placebo effects, can end up reducing the anxiety that they feel. So in some sense, that kind of incorrect misinformation that they read can then become correct information for that person. And it is in some sense true that the oil is reducing their anxiety. It's just not because of the specific chemicals or specific aspect of the oil itself. It's more from these expectations generally. And this ties a lot in role with this idea of a confirmation bias, where throughout the day, we often experience all different kinds of changes in the body, like sometimes some like free-floating kind of symptoms or effects. So sometimes we feel like we have a slight headache. Sometimes breathing is a little bit easier or slightly harder than before. Sometimes your foot is just a little bit cooler or a little bit warmer, with like no obvious cause of these different kinds of things. And so sometimes when you consume a placebo, these kind of free-floating effects or these free-floating kind of symptoms, they can be misattributed to the drug itself. So let's say that you see online that this kind of oil, it can reduce your anxiety, but it can give you a small migraine at the same time or something like this. Once you consume this oil, this kind of free-floating small headache that you had and maybe didn't even notice before can then be reinforced. So you think, I took this oil and now I have this small headache. So then the next time that you take that oil, it's also through these nocebo effects, perhaps more likely that you experience the headache as well. And so this link in that way becomes more conditioned like that through this kind of reinforcement. And sometimes the kind of local effects of this misinformation is a positive thing. So let's say that you're anxious, you don't know how to calm yourself down, you see online that this particular oil can help you, and then you consume this oil that say has like no major effects, but through this kind of non-specific effects, through this placebo effect, you then feel more calm after that. That can be kind of a positive effect for you, or like at least a harmless effect. And the way the effects become more interesting is more on the system level. So as you say, tell your friends about this effect that you had, you're now kind of spreading that first misinformation, say, post that you saw. And then these people may be less likely to seek other treatments and then maybe trying these less effective treatments. And so sometimes what can be helpful, like positive misinformation in some sense, where it has this like positive local effect on the broader scale, it may have more negative effects. And we saw this as well with the COVID vaccine that we were talking about. Some studies have tried to estimate how much of the side effects of the vaccine were actually nocebo effects, and so they tested this by trying to zoom in on the control groups in these COVID vaccine trials and trying to see how many side effects or nocebo effects are reported there just from a saline injection. And they found that in this one study, about 35% of the people who received saline injections or these kind of placebo injections also reported negative effects from this, things like headaches and fatigue. And so on that kind of level, if these people then tell others, oh, I got this vaccine and I had a headache and fatigue, just being aware of these as potential side effects can also make it more likely that people experience it. And so on this kind of more system level, this kind of misinformation can influence how likely people are to experience different placebo effects or different nocebo effects, and then it also can influence the uptake of different treatments, such as the COVID vaccine. And so we're hoping by doing this kind of research, trying to look at these links between things like the placebo and nocebo effect and things like magic and misinformation, we can ideally kind of leverage these placebo effects, use these placebo effects in positive ways, and then try to reduce these nocebo effects. Because from the patient's point of view, sometimes they don't care where the effect comes from. They care more that they're healing and that they don't have those negative effects. And so I think that studying magic is one of the key components here in order to leverage this kind of deception in more positive ways.
Thank you, Dr. Olson. That was great insight. And I was going to hit you up for some of those placebos as well. The weekend's coming up, so I'll be in touch. But so thank you to all of our panelists. We do have some time here, which is great, for some questions. And we have some really fantastic questions. And my first question comes from Scott. And he wants to ask, when it comes to misinformation, there's such an intentionality behind it by people who, like magicians, are trained to distract and deflect the viewer, overwhelm them with stimulation, and know exactly how to do this. So his question was, and I'll pose this to the group, but I know Jeanette wanted to take the first crack. Has anyone done any brain mapping while a subject is watching magic to see how this stimulates the brain and where the brain things are really firing? And is that the same area that we see when they're getting misinformation? So Jeanette, do you feel comfortable answering that? And then if the other panelists want to take a crack at it as well, we'll invite you in.
Yeah, great question, Scott. And specifically pertaining to the correlation between misinformation and magic, no. However, there have been fMRI, functional MRI studies that have been conducted out of the lab of Dr. Stephen Machnick and Dr. Susanna Martinez-Conde. They're both at CUNY in New York. And they, for years, have been studying the neuroscience of magic and to look at how sort of these neural correlates of deception work in the mind. Both of them have written extensively for Scientific American, had a long-running column, and then also if there's any kind of pop sci fans watching, I'm sure many people, given the context of this talk, may be familiar with their book, which is Sleights of Mind. And they do talk about some of their early studies that were done with fMRI, looking at where they would have participants watch specific pieces of magic, like the cups and balls, and things along that line, and be trying to find those neural correlates. I also have to give a shout out to Dr. Tony Barnhart, who contributed to that book, and I know that he and his class are watching on this Zoom. So thanks to your contributions to that research as well. I'll drop a link to where you can find more information about Dr. Machnick and Dr. Martinez-Conde's work on at least just more specific fMRIs and magic.
Great. And Dr. Olson or Dr. McKinney, do you have anything to add to that? Any insight on that topic? Great. All right. Our next question comes from Malika, and she's in Maryland, joining us from Maryland. And she wants to know, does it help if sources leave the conclusion up to the reader? And for example, offering truth to both sides of a topic. And do you feel that this may be the future of scientific publication? And I think Dr. McKinney, that sounds like a question right up your alley. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that topic.
I think that you'll find that the facts that you present actually then can lead to the conclusion. So you have to worry about the selective inclusion of specific facts. So I don't know that just providing, so the basic science is sufficient. You need some contextualization from somebody who understands the strengths and weaknesses of the various pieces of evidence that have been presented. There is use to that interpretation.
Thank you. Dr. Olson, do you have any insight on that topic?
Nothing to add there, no.
Okay, that's great. And I think that answers that well. Hopefully, Malika, that answered that question for you. Here's a question I think maybe posed towards Dr. Olson, and then I'm sure Jeanette will have some insight into this as well. Does magic still work as magic if people know how the trick works? And like a placebo, will it continue to have effect? Dr. Olson, I think that's a question right up your alley. Do you have some thoughts?
Yeah. So magic that fools magicians is often different from magic that fools non-magicians. And so magicians sometimes have a subset of their tricks that they primarily perform for magicians. And sometimes I learned this the hard way, where there was a particular routine that I really enjoyed, that magicians really enjoyed. And so I would practice kind of show magicians this, and they liked the technical aspects and that kind of stuff. And then I tried it out on non-magicians, and they completely didn't like it. And so basically, when you're performing, you have to think about the expectations that the person has, and this leads to where they pay attention and that kind of thing. And so let's say that I have a coin, and then if I put it in one hand, all the magicians are paying attention, or the non-magicians are paying attention here, and then the magicians are paying attention here. So their spatial attention is different. Sometimes the temporal attention is different, and that the secret doesn't always line up with the kind of moment of wonder or the surprise moment. And so magicians often appreciate magic tricks in some different ways. Like once you know enough magic tricks, it becomes a lot harder to be fooled, though magicians similarly have different kinds of blind spots. And so if magicians know that the people watching, like say the magician audience, has certain assumptions and certain expectations, then the magicians can just leverage this in the same kind of way. And so once you learn more magic, so you're definitely less likely to be fooled, but sometimes you're more likely to appreciate it in different ways. And then the times that you are fooled, you just get your socks completely knocked off, and then your mind is blown, because sometimes the person is leveraging the kind of assumptions and expectations that you think that you have that they're then exploiting.
Yeah, I second all of that. Magicians watch magic incredibly differently than non-magicians. And again, because there is that different context, there is that different framing. And, we are not often having, sort of the same, in the question you spoke to was on, do you experience as magic? I mean, at least speaking for myself and for context, I've been a magician for 28 years. This is my full-time job. And I've been sleeping and breathing this almost every waking second of my life. And, I watch things from a very technical standpoint. And the way in which, for example, like I'm not a musician, I'm going to listen to a piece of music, and a friend of mine who's a composer is going to listen to that piece of music very differently than I as a non-composer, so there's also just the idea of viewing things through a very technical lens versus not. So I think that factors in as well.
Thank you, Dr. Olson and Jeanette. That was some great insight, and I hope that answered your question. Dr. McKinney, I'm getting, we're coming up on the end of our time, and we appreciate everyone attending our event. Dr. McKinney, I'm getting a lot of comments about your frog clock as well, so you might want to drop a link to that. I've gotten probably more of those questions than any other piece of background art in my experience as a moderator. But again, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Jeanette Andrews, Dr. Ross McKinney, and Dr. Jay Olson for your wonderful insight on such an important topic. We truly appreciate your participation and your thoughtful discussion. Please, those of you in the audience, join our next event for discussion on climate change and health on February 10th. Check out our Bill of Health and for our wonderful blog on this topic and on many, many more, and sign up for the Petrie-Flom newsletter where you can get more information about these events and other programming that we do. Again, thank you to the Petrie-Flom Center for giving us this opportunity. Thank you to all of our panel. Thank you to Laura Chong and Chloe Reichel for being in the background and ensuring a successful event. And thank you, most importantly, to all of our participants today for making this a reality. We appreciate your time. And again, this will be uploaded as a video content in a couple of weeks. So be sure to look out for that link and continue to check back on our website for that programming. Thank you again, everybody. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time here at the Petrie-Flom Center.